Welcome back, YouTubers! Glad to have you here today for another Java programming tutorial. Today we're going to be covering for loops. I'm super excited to teach you guys about for loops because when you start to combine for loops with some of the other things we learned previously, you can start to do some really powerful stuff. So first I'm going to go over a quick intro, and then we're going to cover when you'd want to use for loops. After that, we're going to talk about syntax. I'm going to do some quick examples, and lastly, we're going to do a very specific example that a lot of teachers, a lot of professors like to use in tests. It's a very common example. It's where you calculate the power using a base and exponent. It's basically exponents in math, but I'll show you that at the end. So first, when would you want to use a for loop? Well, you use for loops when you have a repetitive task to do and you have an incrementing counter or something that you want to change every single iteration through the loop. And so with that in mind, let's go ahead and just throw up the syntax for a for loop. It starts off with the word for, which our IDE highlights for us. Then you basically have to set a variable value that is used throughout the loop usually. You then declare a Boolean expression, and lastly you do you give it the operation that you want to happen for every iteration of the for loop. And then you use brackets, and so all the code that you put in between these brackets here will be executed every single iteration of the for loop. Alright, so notice that each one of these parts of the actual for statement up above is separated by a semicolon, the same way that you end a line of code in Java. So what's going to happen is, let's go ahead and just throw out a quick print line so we can run this example. Okay, so what's going to happen is I said that for loops will execute something a certain number of times. So what it's doing is it's basically going to count from 0 up until 9 and do whatever's in between these brackets that many times. So if I run this program, we're going to see hello world printed out, and then hi will be printed out 10 times, right? Because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 plus 0 is 10. So running it, and sure enough, that's what we get. That's going to be really hard to count, so just trust me, it's 10. But if you don't believe me, let's go ahead and change that 10 to a 3. And so what will happen now is it'll do it 3 times. Let's run it again, and sure enough, we see the word hi there written 3 times. So what's actually happening here in the syntax? The first iteration of this loop comes through and it sets I to be equal to 0. It then jumps down into the brackets and prints out the word hi. Lastly then, it increments the counter. Plus plus is basically another way of writing I equals I plus 1. And notice that you can do that as well because that's an operation that it's a valid operation basically. The next iteration of the loop, it actually will skip this first part because it already did it the first time you went through the loop. But the second time through the loop, I will already be equal to 1. So it makes this Boolean conditional check, and it says, is I less than 3? And since I is 1 this iteration, that turns out to be true, so we go ahead, do the code in between these two brackets, then come back and add 1 to I. So we come back around again to for the third time of this loop. We skip the first part. We do our Boolean check, which is I less than 3? And I is, remember, 2 this time around, so yes it is. And then we go ahead and execute the code in between the two brackets, or in between the two braces. The last part, as always, is you do your operation on the end, which is I equals I plus 1, so I becomes 3, and the for loop continues around again. It skips the first part and goes to the Boolean check and says, is I less than 3? This time, I is 3. So this Boolean check actually returns false, which kicks us out of the for loop, and then our execution path continues on its merry way. So let's go ahead and print out something here to see when our program is going to be ending. And lastly, let's go ahead and say hi for the ith time. Okay, so what did I do here? Each time this code gets executed, we're going to print out to the console hi for the, and then it's going to use this variable I, which should be changing every single time, and then time. So let's go ahead and run it. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens, except second time doesn't really make sense, so let's take out the th. And run it again. There we go. And so that's for loops. Now you can spice up your for loops a little bit. You can basically insert some more fancy operations that occur internally inside your actual for loop syntax. So let's go ahead and just play around with that. For example, if I declared I up here, you don't actually have to declare the variable at the first part of your for loop. But please notice, you do have to actually set the variable. See, it will complain about this. So even though you've set the value to 5, if I run this, for example, this first part's going to reset it to 0. Let's go ahead and create a second variable and set that to be 2. And let's say each time around we want to take k and set it to be equal to what it was previously multiplied by 2. So we'll go ahead and do a quick printout just to see what this looks like. And look at that, the first time k is 2 because it executes this after the code block gets executed. So we set k to be 2, that doesn't happen yet, and so 2 gets printed out. The next time around, k becomes 4, right? Because you have 2 times 2 equals 4, so it prints out 4, and then 2 times 4 is 8, and so on and so forth, and then our loop ends. What other fancy things can you do? Yes, this right here. The middle part of your for loop syntax, the Boolean expression. That can be any Boolean expression. So, for example, let's say that we want to stop this loop when I is greater than or equal to 3, which is basically what this is saying. The loop will continue to run as long as I is less than 3. But let's also say that we want the loop to run and k is less than or equal to 4. So what that's going to do is, in order for the code block to execute in here and for this loop to continue, you need to have both this and this Boolean expression to be true. Because basically what it's just doing an AND expression. And we'll cover that a bit later, but know that AND means both parts of the equation have to come out or have to evaluate to be true. So what should happen in this case, since we are going to require k to be less than or equal to 4, that last iteration of the loop should not happen because k will be 8 when that occurs. So let's go ahead and run it and try it. And sure enough, we end after the second time. Well, always count from 0, or always start counting from 0, but the second time. Alright, so that covered syntax, gave you a few examples. So now, how would we use this in the real world? Well, I'm glad you asked, and I've tried to pull this example out a couple times already, but since I hadn't covered for loops, I couldn't really show it to you guys. But before we write any code, we need to do a quick review on exponents. So here I have two examples of how to calculate exponents. 2 to the 6th, and 5 to the 3rd. So exponents are made up of two parts. There's a base and then a power or an index. In our first example, 2 to the 6th, our base is 2 and our power is 6. So what this translates to mathematically is 2 multiplied by itself 6 times. So 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And that comes out to be 64. And in case you don't believe me, 2 times 2 is 4, times 2 is 8, times 2 is 16, times 2 is 32, and then times 2 is 64. Similarly, 5 to the 3rd, the base is 5, power is 3, and this is equal to 5 times 5 times 5. 5 times 5 is 25. 25 times 5 is 125. So that's basically how exponents work. So now let's write the code for that. So we have a function here called calculate power, and that will be the method that we use to perform this calculation. You can see it takes two parameters, the base and the power, and these will basically line up with our previous examples. So let's, from our main, go ahead and make a method call to that method, and we'll pass in both our examples, 2 to the 6th and 5 to the 3rd. And just so we can actually see what's going on or see the result, let's go ahead and just print these results right out to our console. So we'll wrap the method call in a system.out.println method call. And then in here, all we have left to do is write the code for this. So we're going to return a result to the user, and let's go ahead and immediately set that result to be equal to the base. And then, because this Java programming tutorial covered for loops, we need, of course, a for loop. So let's go ahead and write our for loop. And what we want to do with each pass of the for loop is we want to reset the result to be equal to the previous iteration's result multiplied by the base again. And so if you think through this, what happens is every time, so let's just take an example, 5 to the 3rd. What you're doing is every time you're multiplying the base times the previous result, because the result of 5 times 5 is 25, and then for the last iteration you're going to want to do 25 times 5 again. And so 5 is the base, so that's non-changing, but the changing part is the result, and you use the result from the previous iteration of the for loop. And then of course at the end of the function, at the end of our method, our return value is of type integer, which is why the result is of type integer. We return the result, and that's all there is to it. So let's go ahead and run this. We should see two numbers coming out to the console because we're calling this method twice. 2 to the 6th, remember as we said, was 64. And then 5 to the 3rd is 125, so we should see both those answers. Let's click the run button. And sure enough, that's what we see. But we're not quite done yet. What happens if we try to take any number, let's just go ahead and pick 4, for example, and raise it to the 0th power? When you have any base and raise it to the 0th power, or your index is 0, that should come out to be 1, and that is a special case. If we run this, we see that this is not true. We get the result of 4, and that's because we set the result immediately right off the bat to be equal to 4. And this is actually not what we want. There's a special case here, and we need to catch it. So we can catch this with a simple if statement. The way we check for this is we'll know that anytime the power is 0, we need to just return the value 1. So let's go ahead and do that. If the power is equal to 0, then we will want to return 1. It's as simple as that. Let's go ahead and run this. And sure enough, the result came back correct for that last method call. Let's go ahead and try it again with just some other random number. Let's try 10 and see if that works. It sure did. And so that is basically for loops in a nutshell. I hope you have enjoyed this Java programming tutorial. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below.